Good morning and welcome to SACAP's Teachers Webinar as we explore the need to be inclusive of various forms of diversity within the classroom and more specifically implementing teaching strategies for inclusive education. I am your host Stephanie Dahan and I am the events coordinator for SACAP. So in a complex and diverse South Africa, teachers are tasked with delivering a curriculum in a way that is inclusive yet still inspiring to the young minds of South Africa. Natalie Donaldson will take us through diversity and educator responsibility. Kiara will take us through coping with learning disorders. Dr. Sousa will take you through a teacher's guide to supporting children with special learning and educational needs. And lastly, Jean-Pierre will take us through learning through song and dance. Natalie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Steph. And thank you everybody for being here early on a Saturday morning. I'm quite honored to be opening up the session today on diversity in the classroom space. My name is Natalie Donaldson, as Stephanie has said. I'm the head of teaching and learning on the SACAP at SACAP, and I'm in charge of the postgraduate and professional programs. I am also a research associate at Rhodes University in Grahamstown as well. And hopefully this is the last year that I will be doing my PhD in the psychology of education. So let's get started on what I'm about to talk about today, which is around diversity in the classroom, to open up today's session. So South Africa, as we all know, has been nicknamed the Rainbow Nation since the end of apartheid. And what this basically implies is that, you know, we celebrate diversity and we acknowledge the diversity that exists in our country. And given our history of discrimination, prejudice, and exclusion, there have been concerted that we live, work, and learn in. And schools specifically have become one of the spaces where those transformation objectives have been, you know, kind of seen as one of the spaces where we can make transformation sort of happen. So for example, the South African Schools Act talks about how schools must address the issues of past prejudices in the education system and replace them with quality education that is accessible to all. Desegregation of our schools have become very diverse in terms of racial, class, gender, religious, linguistic, and physical differences, to name a few. And essentially the principle underlying all of our policies related to education is that acknowledging and addressing diversity will result in equality for all. However, as we know, and as teachers, we know that what looks good on paper and in policy and in theory is often quite difficult to practically implement. And this is the case when it comes to education. But what does diversity actually mean in the classroom space? Diversity seems like quite a simple concept, but in practice, it really is quite a complicated and complex phenomenon. Difference or diversity in the South African context is often thought to relate specifically to race, religion, culture, language, gender, sexualities, and other identities. But as teachers, we also need to acknowledge that diversity is more than just this. It also encompasses things like thoughts, actions, personalities, values, beliefs, interests, upbringing, and worldviews, and so much more. As educators, we need to understand this, since these are all factors that shape every child and adult and sets them apart from others. In classroom spaces and in school, there still exists this assumption that children or learners must abide by the monoculture of school rules. But these school rules and traditions are often insensitive to diversity. Rules or regulations that were not questioned in the past are now being challenged as our schools have become more diverse and the expectations of our students and learners have changed. We can see this through the many examples that have taken place over the last few years in the news, where students and learners are actually rebelling against the rules of the schools that they are in. And this includes both private and public schools. So students and learners and schools have been caught in a battle over, for example, the length and texture of hair, beards and burqas, or a red string bracelet and other religious paraphernalia. Even when children with disabilities attend mainstream schools, teachers do not always regard them as their primary responsibility. And often we develop lessons and teach without these students in mind. What this shows, though, is that our schools are faced with a diverse population of children from a variety of backgrounds. And in most cases, schools are finding managing this diversity quite difficult. The cultural ethos of uniformity in schools can no longer be how we teach, given uniformity often erases differences and individuality. We do need to acknowledge that teachers and educators have not been adequately trained or prepared to manage diversity. So the end of apartheid happened and suddenly we had, diverse students in our classrooms, and no one kind of taught us or told us how we are meant to meet the needs of all of these students. So this is not necessarily any fault of our own. Teacher education and training, for example, hasn't actually been that effective in preparing teachers for the reality of their classroom space. But while teaching learners with diverse needs is a challenge, we do need to be able to cater for the needs of all the learners in our classroom space if we want to ensure that our learners not only receive a quality education, but can also be successful in their learning processes. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about what the research says about the common challenges that teachers are facing in their classrooms when it comes to diversity. In research, the biggest challenge that teachers have spoken about is around language differences. And I think this is quite obvious in a country where we have 11 official languages, but our schools are still being, the majority of our schools and universities are being taught in English. Language rights, which includes the right to be taught and to learn in the language of one's choice, are guaranteed by our Constitution. But these language rights have created significant challenges for not only for learners, but also for teachers. Learners do speak different home languages and have different levels of competence in the language of teaching and learning, which, as I've said, is often English. What this means is that teachers and educators cannot adequately support learners whose primary language is not English. And this not only impacts on their learning, but also the academic and social relationship between teachers and learners. What also tends to happen is that the learner whose home language is different from that of the dominant group at school is often made to feel that their home language is a second-rate language, and this often results in poor self-esteem. But language is quite a complex thing to kind of think about when we're talking about diversity in classrooms, because English is the language of access. And what I mean by this is that English does allow people to engage in studies, debates, publishing, research, and employment outside of South Africa. So the question we're often left with is, how do we balance challenging language barriers in our schools while also ensuring that we don't restrict international opportunities for our learners? Another significant challenge for teachers is around cultural diversity. So research has found that one's cultural background can have an impact on how students learn. And diversity in cultural background means that students from diverse backgrounds are all exposed to different ways of doing things and learning things. So things like values, different traditions, different beliefs impact on how a student learns in the classroom. So if we ignore cultural differences, this can and will affect whether learners can participate fully in classroom spaces. The next challenge is around learning differences, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because my colleagues after me will be going into more depth around learning differences and learning disabilities. Mostly in research, learning differences focuses on learning disabilities. However, we do need to recognize that students have different ways of learning, whether they have a learning disability or not. The research has found that there are various kinds of learning disabilities in South African schools, and these include challenges around hearing, listening, and assimilation. And when learning disabilities are not taken into account in mainstream schools, this affects the learning process of students, leading to poor results and performance in class. Furthermore, often learning differences and disabilities may create stereotypical views in the minds of teachers, which can transform into prejudices over time. And finally, identity differences is also a big challenge that teachers will face in the classroom space. And identities include things like genders, sexuality, race, socioeconomic status, religion, and so on and so forth. These are all things that impact on a student's feelings and experience in the classroom space. And we do need to try and take all of these different identities into account when we are teaching. So I'm going to end off my section now, just talking a little bit about what we can do as teachers, given the challenges of diversity in our classroom. Managing diversity in the classroom space as a teacher is not easy, given the lack of time and resources and a curriculum that is often out of our control. So there is no easy fix to this, but there are a couple of things that we can do. One strategy includes educating ourselves on what we can do better in our classrooms to meet the needs of each of our students and learners. So for example, the policy on screening, identification, assessment, and support, which targets all learners in urban and rural settings who need support, does provide guidelines and information on the procedures in supporting learners who experience barriers to learning. As teachers, we also need to take the time to identify students and learners who are in need of additional support and find ways to ensure that they receive the support. We also need to be reflective in our own practice in the classroom. For example, research identifies essential questions that are important for teachers and educators to ask themselves. So questions such as, who am I? How do I see my role as a teacher? And what kind of teacher do I want to be? In not acknowledging diversity in our classroom, we also do a disservice to our students and learners. If we are not acknowledging and responding appropriately to diversity, we do not provide a space where students and learners can actually learn from each other. Finally, we also need to try and move away from just trying to get students through the schooling system, but to work with what Bell Hooks calls an engaged pedagogy or a pedagogy of care. And my favorite quote related to education is this one that you see on your screen now, which is from Bell Hooks, where she argues that to educate as a practice of freedom is a way of teaching that anyone can learn. That learning process comes easiest to those of us who teach, who also believe that there is an aspect of our vocation that is sacred. We believe that our work is not merely just to share information, but to share in the intellectual and spiritual growth of our students. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we have to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. The relationships and interactions between students and teachers have been found to be crucial to the success of classroom activities. If we show care for our individual students and try to meet them where they're at, they will feel heard, they'll feel like they belong, and they'll feel like they're worthy and can succeed. I'm going to hand over now to Kiara. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was absolutely informative. And good morning, everyone. My name is Kiara Parsuram, and I am the Student Liaison Coordinator for SACAP, the Durban campus. And this is my first teachers webinar, so I'm really excited to get right into it and discuss learning difficulties that students have to face, as well as coping with these learning difficulties. So let's begin. So learning difficulties, what are they? So basically they are neurological challenges which affect the way the brain receives, processes, stores, and analyzes information. So a learning difficulty also is referred to as a learning disability, can be described as an issue or a learning difficulty, which it's our brain's inability to process information in an accurate way. So individuals who have a learning difficulty may not learn in the same way or as quickly as their peers, and they may find, certain aspects of learning, such as basic development of skills, a bit challenging, if I can say that. And it is important to note that there is a stat fact where 4 million children and teenagers have a learning difficulty, and many of them cope with more than one difficulty at the same time. So the possible causes of learning difficulties are seen below here, which are your genetic influences, brain development, as well as environmental effects. However, it is not entirely clear as to what causes learning difficulties, but researchers believe that it is the three that you see in front of you. So while learning difficulties appear to be in families, researchers are uncertain whether it is due to these genetic causes or if it's the reoccurrence appears because children, typically learn from their parents or model things from their environment. So brain development before and after birth might also have an impact on the development of learning difficulties. And children who were born prematurely had low birth weight or sustained a head injury may be more likely to actually have a learning disability. When it comes to environmental effects, toxins as well as poor nutrition are key influences when it comes to these disabilities, and they are potential factors that are in the development of learning difficulties. So that is why we always say from a young age, a good diet, good nutrition is very vital for a child's development. Even when we look at certain aspects when kids are studying, we always say that a good balanced diet needs to be put in place during the examination period as well. So then we move forward to the different types of learning difficulties. So a learning difficulty might often be termed as a hidden disability, and I'll get to the reason as to why that is shortly. So a person challenged by a learning difficulty is generally of average or above average intelligence, and many are able to hide the fact that these certain aspects of academic learning give them issues for years, leaving these issues unaddressed until high school or even later. And the reason as to why we call it a hidden disability is because a lot of students feel like they might be labeled or they might be stereotyped because of these disabilities. So that actually results in a difficulty in the gap between an individual's potential for achievement and the ability to actually achieve. So it often hampers their processing of information as well as their future potential success. So sometimes we always say it's better to speak about it than keep it bottled up and hidden. So when looking at the diagnostic or statistical manual, which we all know as the DSM, this classifies learning difficulties under specific learning disorders. And these difficulties are marked by impairment in reading, mathematics, as well as written expression. So when looking into the impairment of reading, we are able to see that the DSM states that with specific learning disability, there is an inaccuracy with word reading, the reading rate of fluency, as well as reading comprehension. So, some students may take longer to read than others, and I might take maybe a day to read 10 pages, while someone else may take a week to read 10 pages. So, there's a difference between that. And then with regards to the impairment with mathematics, the DSM specifies that this is a learning disability with number sense, memorization, accuracy of fluent calculation, and lastly, accurate math reasoning. So a term which is used to describe the pattern of difficulty characterized by these numerical problems is known as dyscalculia. So dyscalculia is used to specify this particular pattern of mathematical difficulties. Lastly, when it comes to the impairment in written expression, the DSM specifies the inaccuracy of word spelling, grammar, punctuation, and the clarity or organization of written expressions. So it is also important to note that in the DSM, it is seen that dyslexia is an alternative term used to refer to a pattern of learning disabilities when it comes to certain things like written expression and impairment with writing. And these are characterized by problems with inaccuracy of fluent word recognition, poor decoding, as well as poor spelling abilities. So besides the difference of learning disabilities according to the DSM, we also have disabilities such as your auditory processing disorder, also known as central auditory processing disorder. So this is where individuals with this type of disability may have difficulty in recognizing differences between sounds, understanding the form of sounds, as well as recognizing and separating background noises. So language processing disorder is another one of them. So this type of disability makes it difficult for individuals to give meaning to sounds, and as well as when it comes to grouping them. And it relates to the processing of both expressive as well as receptive language. And then we have nonverbal learning difficulties. So these, typically make it difficult for individuals to interpret, facial expressions and body language. So your visual, spatial, your motor, your social skills, may be all affected by this type of difficulty. And then lastly, we have your visual perceptual and visual motor deficit. So this type of deficit can actually affect a person's understanding of visual information, their ability to draw and copy, hand-eye coordination, and their ability to actually follow along text on paper. So people who have dysgraphia or a non-verbal learning disability may also have this type of impairment. And one thing, I think it's a, how can I say, it's a deficit, like a disorder that a lot of people actually are familiar with, which is ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's very common amongst our, society, and it is seen that it affects almost 1.5 million children yearly, and it makes it difficult to focus, which might result in maybe even one student disrupting an entire classroom. However, this is not technically considered a learning difficulty, but research does show that between 30 to 50% of children have both ADHD and a specific learning disorder, which makes it more challenging for an individual to cope with. So a few signs of ADHD to maybe just look out for is when a student is unable to sit still, they being disorganized, forgetful, they have a difficulty in staying quiet or being attentive. There is a lack of motivation along with mood swings or emotional outbursts. So moving on from that is how we can actually cope with these learning difficulties. So an individual diagnosed with learning disability may find the diagnosis difficult to cope with, as might as a person's family, because obviously getting news that you have a psychological issue or learning disability is hard on everyone. It becomes a very unsettling environment for both students, the parents as well. So parents may actually worry that a learning disability will prevent their child from succeeding in school, but this is not necessarily the case, because it is a given fact that one might fear of becoming labeled or, worry that plans for future potential careers may be impacted. So some of the ways in which we could, help cope with these is through making contact with your lecturers, mental health care professionals, as well as specialized professionals as well, whom are able to frequently work with students who have a learning difficulty. And these professionals can actually help identify particular areas of difficulties, and as a result, come up with, study guides and study plans just so that you can cope with all of the difficulties that you experience. You can also seek therapeutic help. So a therapist can also help individuals understand that although learning disabilities are lifelong, many methods are out there to help, support that. And but occupational therapy, as well as educational therapists, speech therapists, all can work together to help students cope with this. So when you look at occupational therapy specifically, they can help with motor skills, while educational therapists can work with school-aged individuals to improve skills such as reading, writing, and math. And speech therapists can work with children who maybe have language-based or reading comprehension issues. And then lastly, we have psychological counseling. And for me, I think this is very important because, as I mentioned before, a lot of people look at this as a hidden disability. So it's a given that we always keep it bottled up because we don't want to be labeled. We don't want to be, the student or the kid that has this difficulty, and we don't want to be looked down upon. So counseling is, a good way to move forward. So counseling can be helpful when those learning difficulties overwhelm you and you become shy and anxious, or otherwise in general find it, challenging to express yourself to others. So, with emotional distress that could occur, counseling psychologists can help talk you through these anxieties in a therapy session, and it may prove very beneficial. So as I come to the conclusion of my talk today on this webinar, it is critical to remember that while people with learning disabilities learn in various ways, that doesn't necessarily mean that their methods are ineffective. So when given the correct support, people with intellectual impairments can lead very much fulfilling, happy, as well as very productive lives in their own ways and in their own communities. And being from the South African College of Applied Psychology, we like to commend the bravery and commitment of the families, individuals, and other supporters who have worked relentlessly to enhance the lives of those worthy people. So that brings me to the end, and I thank you all for being absolutely attentive. And I will now be handing through to Dr. Diana de Sousa, who will be discussing the Teacher's Guide to Supporting Children with Special Learning and Educational Needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kiara. And thank you for introducing the topic of my talk. So I am Dr. Suarez de Sousa. I'm an education and research psychologist by profession. And I'm also the head of teaching and learning, academic standards and quality assurance at SACAP. So the title of my talk focuses pretty much on the Teacher's Guide. So as we move to the next slide, the overview of my talk is made up of various aspects. So firstly, I'm going to provide an overview as this slide presents, and it touches on very much what both Kiara and Natalie have highlighted in their talks. So firstly, a learning disability encompasses a wide range of disorders of processing information. They vary in severity, and it can be caused by genetic and environmental, or it might be in certain cases an interdeterminate cause. So as Kiara highlighted, there's a host of various professionals that are involved in the diagnosis of a learning disability. And at a very basic level, it involves the assessment of intellectual or cognitive impairment, in many times referred to as the IQ or intelligence quotient. Also assessing a level of social dysfunction combined with IQ, so your social and emotional skills, as well as looking at particular cognitive processes involving auditory, visual, or spatial processing that tends to manifest before the child enters school and produces a range of impairments, from specific limitations in learning to specific higher order skills. And those higher order skills include planning, strategizing, priority setting, cognitive flexibility, short-term memory. So from your tasks of reading to, for example, even money management could be impaired. A learning disability cannot be cured, but it can be supported and accommodated. So Natalie mentioned the CS process, which is one of the support processes that teachers in the schooling context can draw on, and also inclusive teaching strategies, which need to be tailored to the specific learning disability. It's also important to highlight, as Kiara noted in her talk, that there is a possibility of comorbidity among the different learning disabilities. So there may be primary and secondary diagnoses. The nature of the learning disability thus is important because it informs the strategies to support the child to adjust to the demands of academic life. Of course, we read about in the media, there's a lot of famous people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, even non-verbal learning disabilities. So Tom Holland, Jennifer Aniston, Daniel Radcliffe, Keanu Reeves, and even Chris Rock attribute their creative successes in part to the resilience and perseverance they developed to overcome the challenges. So resonating a lot with Natalie's talk about the importance of viewing neurodiversity as a different way of being. Additionally, making a conscious effort not to criticize thoughts, ideas, and actions of children with learning disabilities. Natalie's talk also made me think about the way we use language and why we refer to children with learning disabilities, because they are people first. So we should not define them by their disability. So we should be sensitive in our use of language. So it's a child or children with learning disabilities instead of a learning disabled child. So my next slide now moves into really focusing on an aspect that Kiara touched on, but I will expand on because it ties into the teaching strategies that I will get to as also an important aspect of this webinar. So firstly is that children diagnosed with a learning disability struggle with academic language, spoken or written, leading to difficulties, for example, in reading, writing, spelling, and mathematics. So here I'm looking at very much the SLD, the specific learning disability, specific learning disorder as defined by the DSM, and what Kiara mentioned as your dyslexia, and in the mathematics as your dyscalculia. So what really underlies many of these learning disabilities is this idea of the disorder in processing on information. So it's almost as if certain kinds of information get stuck or lost while traveling through the brain of the child diagnosed with a learning disability. So I really find the little picture here at the bottom of the two cartoon characters. So one says you need to get to A to B. It's a nice direct straight line. And the other person is trying to figure out how to get from A to B, and it's not an exactly straight line. So it's like when you're driving on the highway, you get stuck due to road construction and you need to take a detour. It takes you a lot longer to get where you're going because of the detour. So it's not a problem knowing of what to do. It is a problem of doing what you know. So that for me, in a nutshell, highlights the core challenge of a child with a learning disability. As we move to the next slide, many of the learning disabilities as defined within the DSM that Kiara did refer to in her webinar falls under a neurodevelopmental disorder. And part of that being because that different kinds of information are processed in different areas of the brain. The different areas of the brain mature at different rates, and some skills are learned quickly and more easily, while others require time and practice. So each area of your brain, as this diagram highlights, is responsible for processing the different aspects of information. So your occipital lobe, which is the back of the brain, for example, is important for visual processing. Your temporal lobe, which is the part of the brain more to the side, in this case, it's in this bright blue, is for your auditory processing. Your frontal lobe is very important for your processing of high cognitive executive skills. This is where you're speaking, you're writing, you're planning. And of course, your parietal lobe is very important for visual spatial orientation. So as we move to the next slide, speaking about the brain differences, I think this is a very good way to carry this message of how differently a person with a learning disability processes information in relation to someone who doesn't possess a learning disability. So here you can see an fMRI scan. So it's data from both adults in this instance with a SLD, so a specific learning disability in reading and written expression, and adult controls with no learning disability. And you can see that they were given a visual tracking task to look at a computer screen. So in the visual tracking task, V1 and M1. So V5 and M1 are the areas. So V1 is referring to the part of the occipital lobe, and M1 is part of the neurons within the occipital lobe that are responsible for detecting movement. And you can see that in the person with a learning disability, the V5 and M1 don't shift. So it's almost as if they're still static, or as I said earlier, they might still be stuck and they might take a bit longer to be able to actually become activated. So their brain activity, so the person with a learning disability is much more stuck on processing and recognizing that what was projected on the screen. So you can see that they look as if they're in the earlier stage of the task, recognizing what was the object that they were meant to track. On the next slide. So an important component of the ability to process information involves this aspect of storage, processing, and output. So from the input, we have visual processing, which involves how you can use visual information. And part of that also is asking the following question. When a child sees something, especially something complex, does the child understand it quickly and easily? Can the child visualize things? Like when you're asking them to think about a particular shape, a particular word, can they do that in their head, or what we would say the mind's eye? Can the child remember the information he or she sees? So this is when you're in a classroom situation where the child is looking at a particular worksheet where they're having to read particular instructions. So to get an understanding of what visual processing may mean, I would like you to read the story. So take one moment in this webinar, read the story silently to yourself. Okay, now I'd like you to, so I'd like to move to the next slide. And in the chat box, I want you to try and attempt to answer these 3 questions based on the story you just read. Okay, so some of us might have been quite brave and given it a go. But many of us might be thinking, sure, this was a little bit daunting. Not really sure what you were required to do there. And if we move now to the next slide, now it seems a lot much easier because we can recognize, because a lot of our cognitive processing is intact. So that's the point of this exercise, was to really simulate what it might be like for a child who has a learning disability, particularly with reading and written expression, and is trying to complete a reading comprehension task. So it's to give you a sense of what their worldview or their experience might be. And then, of course, the next slide will actually give you the answer. So well done if you were able to complete the activity in the chat box with the scrambled letters. As we move now to the next task, the other important component in learning disabilities is auditory processing. So this involves how well a child can use auditory information. So when a child hears something, especially something detailed, does the child understand it quickly and easily? Can they hear sounds, numbers in his or her head? And again, can the child remember the information he or she hears? So this is an important aspect of auditory processing. As we move to the next slide, so we've looked at visual processing, auditory processing. Now we move to one that is called processing speed. So processing speed refers to the speed to how fast information travels through the brain. All learners or children with learning disabilities tend to have challenges with processing speed when they have to access information quickly. And sometimes it is accessed through via modalities. So depending on the nature of the learning disability, particularly if they're accessing in their weaker modality, so if it's the auditory modality or the visual modality, that impacts on the speed the information can be processed. So if we were to make that in a very practical example, it is like having the brain work at 40 kilometers an hour when the rest of the world and all the information is going at 80 kilometers an hour. So children with learning disabilities really struggle to keep up with the flow of information that they are processing through their senses on a daily basis. To give you a bit of another practical example is, I'm going to ask you to, in the chat box, consider and see if you can recall who was the first president of South Africa. So give yourself a moment to see if you can recall and give this task a go. As you are working in the chat box, I'll explain why this is a good example. It's because there's so many components or concepts that you're having to draw in order to come to an answer. First of all, you need to consider that who was is a question. It's also referring to past tense. Also numerical order, the first president. And then president is a leader of a nation. So that's another concept. And then of a particular country, South Africa. So there's a lot of ideas that are actually all strung together in this one simple question. And many a times the child with a learning disability may get stuck at one point of these concepts. Okay. As we move to the next slide, Another important aspect is processing speed around object orientation and identification. So many a times children with learning disabilities struggle with letter sound. So also in order to have the letter in its correct upright orientation, because as we can see on this particular slide, a B and a P are direct reversals of one another, but a B and a P mean different things and they have different sounds. It's also your D and your Q. So you can see that someone with dyslexia, or your SLD with impairments in reading and written expression, may struggle, and very much like that early activity we did, struggle to actually put the letters in their correct orientation and even identify them correctly. On the slide, I've also included a developmental note on letter reversals, because in very early age, in particular your early foundation phase, your letter reversals to some extent is normal and can be expected. Writing is not a natural process for the brain like language is, so writing needs to be taught. And 5 reversals in grade 1 is to be expected. Of course, as the child moves through the grades, it becomes less prevalent. So the idea is that by grade 4, no reversals would be expected. And there tends to be a reversal of your lowercase letters. So processing speed is very important in identifying letter spatial configuration. So letter reversals are common. This brings me to my next slide, which highlights that capital letters are much more easier for children with learning disabilities because they only have one shape and orientation. Of course, it's also important that there could be letter number confusion in children with learning disabilities, and capital letters actually help differentiate your letters from your numbers. Offhand, I can think of the letter M and the number 3, which could be mirror images of one another. As we move now to the next slide, here, what I've highlighted here is features of a learning disability. So what I've done is I've taken very much Kiara's unpacking of the different learning disabilities, and I've just distilled them in a way to what you would view in a classroom environment. So the first is the child may have trouble learning the alphabet, connecting letters to their sounds. The child might not understand what he or she reads, struggle with spelling, confuse math symbols, and misread numbers. The child could also make many mistakes when reading aloud and repeat and pause often. They also may have a messy handwriting, hold a pencil awkwardly, and may struggle to express their ideas in writing. The next slide continues with features of a learning disability, in the sense of a child may learn a language late, have a limited vocabulary, and not follow the social rules of conversation. So, for example, that would be relating to taking turns in class. Maybe they stand too close to the listener. There could be classroom interruptions. And many a times, the social rules of conversation need to be role modeled to children. The child may not be able to retell a story in order. They, for example, might remember the first and then the end, and then they bring the second. So the sequencing is a challenge. They may mispronounce words or use a wrong word that sounds similar. The child may have trouble remembering the sounds that letters make or hearing slight differences between words and struggle with following directions. And organization. A child may have trouble organizing what they want to say or not to think of a word when they need to write or when they need to express it in a conversation. As we move to the next slide, here very much we're moving into particular teaching strategies. So I've tried to group them into different domains to help with organization and clustering them. So the first is around cues and structure. So it's very important to provide high structure and clear expectations, because children with learning disabilities tend to have difficulty focusing on getting started, setting priorities, and completing homework. Also, it's important to create as much structure to allow for fewer distractions, to help with time management, and that will allow for greater focus on schoolwork, for example. Memory or sequencing difficulties, as we've highlighted in looking at your auditory and visual and processing speed challenges for children with learning disabilities, means that any tasks involving memory or sequencing needs to be kept concise and reinforced with brief cue cards. I will touch on cue cards a little bit later as with a specific example, but it's important to repeat or reword complicated directions. So when giving instructions for a task, keep them brief and try highlight them in particular step-by-step order. Break larger tasks into steps and then post examples to model after the task is completed to help with transitions between tasks. On the next slide, we have additional teaching strategies related to working memory. So some children can experience difficulty with integrating information when they are presented orally, which compromises their ability to follow the sequence and organization of a class. So it's important to provide the learners or children with a lesson plan. So what is the overview of what is going to be discussed? And also that lesson plan is important when you're doing transitions. So when you're moving from reading to maths, it's important to cue the children into that there's going to be a change because of that processing delay that many of them might be experiencing. Read aloud when writing new terms and key points on the chalkboard and provide handouts of assignments. When presenting abstract concepts, it's important to paraphrase them using specific words and where possible, try illustrate the steps with diagrams or graphs, hands-on teaching methods, personal experiences to create a multi-sensory approach to your teaching. On the next slide, we have allowing flexibility in classroom procedures, which is, for example, in certain instances, allowing the use of a note recorder for note-taking or test-taking. When children have trouble with written language or cannot assimilate, remember, and organize learning material when listening to the lesson, so note recorders, audio recorders are very helpful. And it's important that flexibility is put in class, but also how having that learner with a learning disability is integrated into the class in a way that doesn't make that learner feel put on the spot or feel stigmatized in relation to the peers. Learning material should be easily accessible, well organized, and stored in the same place. So remember, children with learning disabilities struggle with organization and memory. So try to keep the desk as distraction-free as possible, and where possible, small binders that hold fewer papers. On the next slide, we have some multisensory teaching strategies. Now, evidence-based research highlights that multisensory teaching methods are important. So this is when you can draw on auditory, kinesthetic, tactile, or visual input. So as many senses that can involve in a task, in how you describe it, and also in how you allow for the time for processing of this particular task. The greater number of senses utilized to learn something means there's a greater chance that information will be understood and retained. There's also an aspect around multisensory in relation to how you provide feedback. So it's important that in any task, even in a multisensory task, that feedback is immediate, because children with learning disabilities often don't have a strong academic foundation. So they struggle from processing information even before they start schooling. And then as they move up the schooling ladder, it becomes further compounded as the complexity of reading, complexity of subject matter increases. And they tend to worry about how they performed and how they did. So it's important to highlight that you give immediate feedback to help boost their confidence and esteem. And it's also important to stress effort and enjoyment of a task instead of competition with others. So instead of saying, oh, you're not as good as person X, rather highlight, I can see you've put in a lot of effort and well done, will help boost the confidence of a child with a learning disability who many a times has emotional difficulties due to being diagnosed with a learning disability. As we move to the next slide. So here I've included two teaching strategies. They both focus within the literacy arena. So the first is how you can incorporate self-instruction for how to give cues or steps for a child to write a creative writing exercise. So step 1, think of a story to share with others. Step 2, let your mind be free. Step 3, write down the story parts. Who is the character? When does the story take place? Where does the story take place? What happens? How does the story end? So as you can see, you're breaking down the task into its very, very smaller steps. And it's very helpful for this cue card then to be, it could be audio recorded, and then the child could listen to it at home with their parents. So the more repetition, and also adapting these types of instructions in the learner's strength modality. So if it's the visual, then you can use this, but if they struggle with auditory, then the visual wouldn't work. So it's important that you focus on the child's strength in how you adapt your teaching strategy, but breaking it down into steps is very helpful, because then this becomes a reference document that the child and even parents or caregivers can use. The other aspect is story parts and graphic symbols. So this could be another way to help with memory and how you associate words and symbols. So it will help with, again, the idea of self-regulation, self-monitoring, which is also an important aspect of being able to keep sequence and memory of events, and in particular in a literacy scenario where you're reading stories or you're having to do a creative writing or reading comprehension. So these are ways to break down information in a way that will help with children with processing difficulties. The next slide includes an example of numeracy. So particularly because of some children will have challenges with mathematics and calculations, and in more severe cases, the dyscalculia. So here you can look at, ask, what are the parts of the problem? Circle the numbers needed. Set up the problem by writing and labeling the numbers. Tie down the sign. Decide whether to use addition or subtraction, for example. Discover the sign. Recheck the previous steps. Read the number problems. Answer the number problem. Write down the answer and check if the answer makes sense. So here, even though we take doing a calculation for granted, it's actually quite a complex cognitive process that it entails. So breaking it down into these steps allows for the child that is struggling with processing to be able to manage that task much more easily. And you can see it's about problem definition, planning, strategy use, self-monitoring, and self-evaluation. So you're both able to convey how to calculate an addition or subtraction sum, do the operation, but also at the same time you're building the child's ability to monitor themselves, how to reinforce. So if they are halfway, they can almost use their own self-talk. Great, I'm halfway through the strategy. Or, oh no, I actually need to go back to another step. So building in that self-reinforcement is important at a social-emotional level. As we move to the next slide, we have aspects around behavior. So trying to separate the child from others who may be distracting, particularly children with ADHD, for example, will be helpful to try and keep them in the front of the class, preferably away from the door where there might be more distractions. And children some can be quite distractible, while others may not so. And it's important to model frustration control when role-playing social situations and responding to the child's comment by praising whenever possible. So as I've highlighted before, many children tend to have secondary emotional difficulties and they have a lower sense of self. So it's important when a child does, for example, initiate a conversation or does answer a question in class, that they are praised for taking that initiative and being wanting to contribute to the class discussion, for example. And effective praise is about being specific and sincere. So focusing on effort could be, I can tell you put a lot of time and effort. Focusing on individual progress. You improved since last time. And even focusing on performance could be about you didn't give up even when it was hard. So as we move to the next slide, which focuses on the emotional component. So I've already highlighted this aspect of previously in the importance of immediate feedback, because it also falls under an emotional component for a teaching strategy. but it's about giving constant feedback and positive recognition. So many children have these negative scripts about themselves and their ability, and feedback from a teacher can reduce this negative energy pattern and offers this opportunity for positive self-statements. So allow also the child with learning disabilities to demonstrate their strength. Some actually are very verbal and very creative. And for their peers and for the teacher to really allow that to come through is important, because then once again, we're seeing the child as a possible in their full potential and not necessarily defined just by their disability. So the last slide is this one. And for me, it's getting everyone to hopefully think about learning disabilities in perspective. So every child is unique and has assets and resources that can be recognized and supported. We just need to look and dig deep many a times. It's also important that we determine whether a child can participate in the classroom activities, because some are highly articulate and others might have severe difficulty. So again, we have to look at each child as a unique person. The correct diagnosis is essential. So those DSM diagnoses, whether they're comorbid, whether there's emotional difficulties, for the correct mental health professionals to develop a treatment plan. Collaborating with the child and their families early in the term is very important to understand what the child needs. So it might be in collaboration with the mental health professionals. It could be in collaboration with teachers who are specifically trained within the CS process to identify and implement particular strategies, and then work closely with mental health professionals to see how it's possible to assist the child if there's more than just learning disabilities, and if possible medication or the psychotherapy or occupational therapy or speech therapy that Kiara mentioned. And I would like to end off with a quote by Oprah Winfrey. So every one of us gets through tough times because somebody is there standing in the gap to close it for us. So I truly believe that teachers can close this gap by supporting children with disabilities through implementing teaching strategies, as well as raising awareness about the needs and the challenges, but also the different teaching strategies. And for me, it's being about patience, persistence, and being imaginative in your teaching strategies. Thank you very much, everyone. I will now hand over to JP.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Diana, Kiara, and Natalie. Well done, and I think a really great presentation. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to all the teachers. I am an educational psychologist. My name is Juan-Pierre Moller, and I'm also lecturing psychology at SACAP. I'm also practicing currently at Grantley College, where I am their school psychologist every morning. And then I also do some talks for the Daily Sun and also for ENCA on the news on all topics related to psychology and relationships. So we are starting to learn through song and dance today. So as Dr. Diana said, we are actually now taking multi-sensory learning. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to incorporate all the different types of learning techniques into one, and trying to get this information in all of the children in our classes' heads. So yes, with TV, entertainment, kids with visual, audio, and kinetic cues on the TV, on the screen, in games, teachers have stiff competition to keep students focused. Oh yes, and this means, as someone mentioned in the question Q&As as well, that this means you must keep 35 unique individuals focused and let them all learn something simultaneously, because this is inclusive education. Oh yeah, and it links to white paper 6, and yes, they must be in the mainstream school. Okay, not a challenge at all. So therefore, I'm going to start off with a video of Hannah Montana. I know this might be before some of your times, but yeah, thank you, Steph.
Is next, according to my text. Then comes a tibia, that ain't no fibia. And now I'm up to my knee, yeah, that's the patella to me. We're doing the phone dance, you study the answers again and again till I get it right. We're doing the bone dance, you dance and you learn it, and we won't mess up this test. We'll get it perfect. Come on, everybody, move those femurs.
Yeah, by the look of these tests, you losers need all the help you can get.
Doing the bone dance, you dance and you learn it, and now I take it home with a parietal bone. It might be crazy, but we learn that way. Temporal and frontal too, and now we're finally through. That makes 206. I found a way that clicks. Bone thugs in the house. We're doing the bone dance. You study the answers again and again till I get it right. We're doing the bone dance. You dance and you learn it, and we won't mess up this test. We'll get it perfect. Word.
Thank you so much. So that's just one idea to study through a song. So I'm going to use other songs as well during the rest of my presentation. So if we look at the periodic table, for example, and you have to learn the first 20 elements, you can do it connecting to a song. There is a song that you can download from YouTube even about the periodic elements, or you can do it like I presented here. So in this presentation, you can see it is a periodic table with pictures, with colors, and then also you can add a story for the auditory so that they can hear it as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to please make you imagine the following story. So you can close your eyes for this activity if you want, or you can just listen and imagine the pictures that I sent into your heads. So first of all, you come home and you're outside your porch, but you are drenched wet. You are soaking wet. It is cold, it is miserable, and the water is dripping off of you because you were in such a heavy storm. And you're like, what a day. What is wrong with this day? This is hectic. I can't deal. You open your door, and what do you see inside? You see balloons flying anywhere, everywhere in the room. There are balloons with animal balloons, and there are red ones, and there are blue ones, and there are green ones, and everywhere you see balloons flying all over the house. Now, you hear your cell phone ring, and you're like, where did this come from? This day is just insane. You pick up your phone, and what happens? Your phone explodes in your hand. It explodes, and it goes everywhere, and you're like, this day cannot get any worse. But then what happens is you see this huge diamond ring, shining, bright, plated in gold, laying there on your table. Okay, so that was just 4 of the elements. Now, what happened first? Please answer in the chat box. What happened first? You were at your door and you were? Wait, thank you so much. Yes, and that is water. And then you saw the balloons. Okay, helium. Do you see that? That's helium. So and then afterwards your phone rang and it exploded. Lithium. Okay, lithium is the battery in your phone. After that you got a diamond. Okay, so I just quickly skipped to 4 of the elements, and I explained the story. I connected it with a feeling. I connected it with a scenario. I connected it to your house for the visual cue that you feel safe and that you feel comfortable. And then this was just 4 of the elements, and you can make up a story with everything because we have cues, we have pictures as well, visual cues to help our students. So this is a basic story, and you can do this through everything. You can also connect it with certain words and steps. So if you think, for example, of the SWOT analysis, then what your strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat in business studies, then you can literally say, so you walk into your living room. What are the strengths and good stuff in your living room? Because you're comfortable there, you watch TV, this is nice. So what are your strengths there? Now you walk to your room and there you leave all the weaknesses things, because that's where you cry, that's where you do this, that's where you do this. And by linking the emotions and the rooms, the visual cues, then the students can remember it better. Next slide, please, Steve. Okay, so there's a song called I'm H-A-P-P-Y. I still do today. I spell beautiful. I say B-E-A, beautiful. These are many small things that we use to trigger our memory. Okay, Have you ever heard someone say, I see with my hands when they go to the mall, when they feel a soft pillow? Okay, or have you ever parked, but you have to switch off the radio? Now, what does the radio and sound have to do with you that have to look where you have to park? Okay, so as we've seen before by Dr. Diana, the whole brain is included in learning. And the more areas of the brain that we light up, the better you will remember the information. So an input stage where the teacher gives in the information, that's where you guys come in, to make it creative, to make them remember, to do it in different ways. I know my maths teacher says that Uncle Pythagoras is coming to visit us. And still till today, I was waiting for that guy to come visit. But it was just a concept that she was wanting us to get excited about. Then your brain stores the information. Imagine like a computer. So you type in the words, that's the input. Now you save the file, this is a storage place. And now the output is where you get into the test and you have to give the answer. You have to go and remember what you learned. Now, if you do not get enough sleep, you cannot remember because sleeping puts it in your long-term memory. If you crunch those works all up the day before, you're going to remember between 60 and 70% of the work. However, you're going to forget it within the next 2 weeks. So therefore, if you have to write the exam at the end of the year, it's going to be tough to remember it if you crammed all the work in. Next slide, please, Steve. Okay, so we listen with our ears, we use our eyes, and we also use our hands. These are the learning styles that we use. So I want to explain each one of them briefly for you. So, kinetic, this is where we did the dance. Do you remember when you were a kid? Head and shoulders, knees and toes. Okay, and we pointed to the places so that we can remember which part it is. So this is the same as the bone dance that we just looked and that we just saw. We can use this kinesthetic movement to remember things. If you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough, said Albert Einstein. Why do I say this? If you can explain work to a grade 1, then you know your work. If you can't explain it to them, then you're not sure about what it means. So tell the students that they must explain it to a grade 1, that they understand it. And then things get interesting. Okay, we also have muscle memory that also makes us remember something. So for example, can you remember every time you lock your car, do you sometimes have to go check? Because you're so used to it, it's in your muscle memory that you do it without thinking about it. And that's how awesome our brains are. And that's exactly what we use when we use kinetic learning, when we move while we learn. The next one. I use kinetic learning when I study scripts, when I do some acting work, because I look in the mirror and I pull my face. And when I get something wrong, I'm mad at myself because that mad evokes an emotion, it evokes a visual cue that I have to get this right. Okay, so you can use it in so many ways, in songs, in dance. Learning styles with auditory is through the ears. This can be through videos, this can be through sound. You can record yourself and let it play back to you. We also have at our school accommodation where the computer reads for the students. So listening always helps. You can do this through song, but you can also do it through talking. So teachers, please explain things while you read it out loud for the kids who need that auditory stimulation. You can also use mnemonics. Mnemonics are something that, for example, SWOT, S-W-O-T, like the SWOT analysis, but you can also do it through different things. For example, making a little poem. So we had Meneer van As, my jas sal u nie pas. So that is to remember the different planets in Afrikaans, from the sun outwards. Next one, please. Okay, visual learners want pictures. They want visual videos, but also they can draw little symbols to remember their work. If it's difficult to spell, why not learn through visual cues? Okay, rather make a little stick person to remember something than what you actually have to go and write. That is the person who did that wall. Okay, so like Dr. Hannah said, it's a story. You can say the character name and you can draw a little picture. Then you can say the situation, the plot of the story, you can highlight in yellow. The setting, you can highlight in pink. And then you can draw a little map or a little compass or directions, you know, the north, east, south, west, to remember the setting. Okay, so make little visual cues for the learner, but let them come up with it. Because if you summarize it for them, they have to understand it in their way, not in your way that you give it to them. Next one. So we give them the learning cues, but it's still the child's own responsibility to make the information their own, to understand it in their way. So yes, we can give what we want. And at the end of the day, I'm going to give you guys a lot of resources that you can use as well. For example, there was a question on the Q&A on teaching learners with different languages and also assessing. I mean, our assessments come from Europe. It's normalized there and it's very big English. However, we have a J-size and S-size that's South African norm. But again, it's done in English and we can do it in Afrikaans as well, but not in any other language. But now we have a program called Natalie that has reading books for grade 1 to 3, but it's in all 11 South African languages, the same book. So then they can download the Afrikaans, English, and whatever home language they are, and then they can read it, all of these books, the same story with the same pictures, and then they can see the translation, the sentence structure, and all of that. Next slide, please. So we must look at the students' basic needs. They must feel safe and secure, emotional. We must look at their self-esteem and success. So those mini rewards are great that Dr. Diana spoke about. However, if you are overwhelmed and things are too much for you, like when you see our little paragraph, it's too much. I don't understand this. I want to run away. Then you are in fight and flight or freeze mode. Okay, imagine this dog running after you with saliva coming out of his mouth. He's going to eat you because you just stole something from a house. You are like this. You're panicking. Imagine you're in a car accident. You're panicking, but now the police ask you, please write a case number and please say what happened, which color car drove into you, who was the person who drove into you, what time, how did the road look? How can you remember this information? You are stressed. You were emotional trauma that happened there. So your brain has a little cloud over it. So how are you going to take in any information? Why are you going to go and read? Why is it important now to do the correct spelling, for example, when you are just trying to survive? So we must make our kids feel safe as well. Next slide, please. So we also had a song. Yes, I'm going to sing quickly. I'm just going to sing the first part, but this is the Groot Boekrekening, so the journal of accounting that we had to do right in. And it must be in a specific order. So again, break it down in many steps. Children, especially with ADHD, are multitasking, so they cannot focus at all the steps at once. So break it down for them in many bite-sized pieces. Okay, how do we climb a mountain? One step at a time. So, dis gee voertuie in toerusting en dan ook vaste depose toe. So do you see that those are the first four write-ins at your bates that is on the slide. So it's grond en geboue, voertuie, toerusting. And that's all based on a South African folk song that we just used and then to show what to write in and where to write in. Now, there's a story for the whole ledger, but I'm not going to sing the whole song now. So how does Kurt Darren Socky music make you feel? It makes you all excited. It makes you all happy. And that's the thing, we want to evoke that emotion. We want to see your passion when you teach a certain topic, because the kids are going to feel that. They're going to feed off of it. And remember, kids know when you fake. So please don't do that. But what if there's a disturbance? What if there are sounds outside? What if there are other people talking while you are explaining? Again, now the kids have to multitask and understand what to focus on, because their focus are being scattered everywhere, especially children diagnosed with ADHD. Therefore, we have to make sure that each child has certain things to help them so that they can focus the most effectively. For example, puppets. Not spinners, because they throw it to the different hands and then they don't look at you, but they focus on the hand-eye coordination. So rather a puppet sitting at the back of the class and allowing them to walk at the back of the class, not to disturb the others. Opening a window 20 times, opening and closing the windows 20 times during a lesson. Having press stick at the back of your pen, for example, or sitting on a gym ball. All of these are tools to help your student that is ADHD to focus and to keep his focus on the work. Also, try not to have work printed on white paper. So the white background actually reflects into the child's eye, and students with learning difficulties in reading find this quite difficult. It scrambles the words a bit more. So cream paper, or then if they add a yellow transparency over it, actually helps them a lot. And if you want to refer to someone, Dr. Larry Berman is a developmental ophthalmologist, and he actually looks at the eye tracking and the development. So he takes our IQ assessments and the cognitive assessments, and he adds that to his eye assessment to then help students with that. Next slide, please. Okay, so strategies for learners with attention difficulties. So give learners clear one steps. Teach students to check in with themselves to feel that they're okay. Give their brain breaks in between in the lesson. Stand up, sit down. Okay, we're going to carry on now. Stand up, stretch, touch the roof, touch your feet. Let's go again. Here we go on with our work. Get a timer for work sessions, especially children with autism. Make sure that sometimes they need a watch and sometimes you need to take that watch away. Provide fidgeting toys for them. Use visual as a reminder, so visual with auditory. And play attention boosting games. You can get free online attention games online. It's for free. It's like little maze trackers that go thinner and thinner and things like that to support our students. Next slide, please. Okay, start your day on time. Schedule enough study time for your course load. Employ multi-model learning, as we discussed today, and properly manage your medication. Next slide. So, for homework, break large tasks down in little steps. For behavior, use proactive strategies, use preferential seating systems, and please watch what they eat because your diet improves your mood, improves your attention. Interaction, model frustration control, provide social opportunities. So give them time to take breaks, just to breathe before they come back. And more tips for success, look at their self-esteem and motivate them. Transition, provide students with a definite purpose for each activity and even with rules. Explain to them the reason behind it. Be clear and be positive. Next slide. So there are different types of attention. And the one is sustained attention, the one is selective attention, and the other one is alternative attention. Divided attention. Thank you, Steve. So we deliberately played music now while I was explaining. Why? Because you guys had to listen now with this disturbance while you had to focus on what I'm saying. Even though I gave you a visual cue, it made it challenging to keep focused. So please support your child in each way that they need to stay focused. Next slide, please. Okay, so kids who are diagnosed with ADHD, they're multitasking. Now, what does multitasking do? It actually drops 40% of your productivity, 50% longer to accomplish a single task, and it makes up to 50% more errors. Hence why now it appears as if they have reading difficulties. It appears as if they are processing speed that is slow and not well developed. Why? Because of ADHD. So it may appear the same way, and that's why Dr. Diana said that the professional should really diagnose correctly, not to label the person, but to make them understand their challenge so that they then can be supported in the correct way. Next one, please. So therefore, we have to get our kids to be calm in class. How do we do this? So again, teach them the 5 strategies. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. See 5 things in the room, 5 colors. Touch 4 things that you can touch. Listen for 3 sounds. Smell 2 things that you can smell. And taste 1 thing that you ate this morning. Okay, by that we call it grounding. So let them walk to the toilet and just then use their senses to calm down. Then you can do stop, drop, roll. Stop, calm down in the way that you need it. Drop, think of 3 strategies for this challenge, and roll, put the right one into action. Also teach them about the pause button. So we do dancing and then pause, and then they have to do statues. Okay, use the pause button so that they are not impulsive, but that they pause, think before they give an answer. Tell them, remember your pause button just for that visual cue to help their emotional. Next slide, please. Okay, so the definitions that you can use slides or cards, and you can do, you know, where you put down the blocks and they have to match the correct ones. So you can do this activity, but you can do it with a definition and words. You can also do it through anything that you can put in column A and B. So you put down the different tiles with definitions and with the words on, and they must match the correct ones. Turn them around and see when they can match the correct one. You can make a competition out of this as well. You can also do this with translation for language and also different wars, for example, or different events, and then they must match it to the correct date or to the correct scenario that happened. Next slide, please. So language subjects, you can give them Nalibali to read stories, watch shows in subtitles, but on topics that interest you. Don't tell them to watch them alone if they don't like it. Okay, translation columns will help. So on the one side, you put all the question words in English, and on the other side in Afrikaans. So the translation. Music with subtitles so that they can dance with the songs and the visual cues. Pictionary, shop list to remember you can do in all languages. Next slide. So thank you very much. So that was me and my part. And now we're going to give time for questions and answers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all our speakers. Jean-Pierre, this is a question for you. How do you deal with a classroom of 36 learners when 30% that has learning difficulties when you need to cover the curriculum?
Okay, so we're going to share resources with you guys, which is called the LTSM, that is done by the Department of Education, that breaks down the studying, the topics that you have to cover in your curriculum, but also it groups it nicely, it categorizes nicely, so the students also have the resources at home for free to work on their own. So we're giving the responsibility back to them as well. So it's not only falling on the teacher. Therefore, you can focus on the main topics in class, but if that kid needs enrichment, you don't have to go and give them extra things yourself, but it's already there. So they can download the full textbooks for each grade with support, with different people that explains it to them and so on. They can also YouTube the topics. There are many lecturers and people discussing the topics in a teaching way and also in videos that can support it. Therefore, you have to get to the curriculum. I know people push for that. But if and the department wants it and also your principal. However, try and get to the curriculum. But when you see there are some gaps that need to be filled, try and do that in your revision time as you have some revision time to use. And if not, then ask send the students to extra lessons or then ask the parents to help them with the extra study material that you provide them to support that kid, just to fill those gaps before we investigate for remedial schools and so on. We are currently a school, all our children are diagnosed with something, and then we have a college section. So our college sections don't have a second language or a first additional language. Your first home language goes to first additional, and then they can do a N2, 3, and 4, level 2, 3, and 4. That's on the same base as matric with only one language as a second language level. So there are ways to support them. There are ways to help them further as well. Also with the concessions, but then also, yes, be creative with how you teach so that the kids can see it, hear it, and move with it. So that the more senses we use, the better. Thank you, Seth.
Thanks so much, JP. Natalie, we've got a question for you on diversity and learning difficulties. Would it be more valuable to include this in teacher training programs and similar professional development courses? And if so, what could be core themes of this?
Awesome, thanks so much, Steph. No, good question. I know Kiara has answered the question on the learning difficulties aspect. In terms of diversity, a lot of the teacher training programs do include an aspect around diversity. But what research has found is that this is very often not always a compulsory module that teachers have to take as they are training. And also it's not always very effective in providing like proper tips and guidelines for teachers on how to actually manage diversity. So how to practically apply, the theory that they learn in their training. Yeah, themes would include, I think, looking at the various aspects of diversity. So some of the things that I did speak about today, but also going a bit more in depth in terms of identity as well, I think would be a good aspect to include in teacher training programs. And then obviously practical, tips for teachers and how they can actually practically apply, the things that they learn so that they know how to do things in their classroom to manage diversity and acknowledge and recognize diversity. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Kiara, we do have a question for you. How do we increase motivation in students?
Hi everyone, so I hope you can hear and see me again. So I think that one way in which we can actually increase motivation in students is by understanding two different types of emotions that students have, which is your extrinsic and intrinsic. So your intrinsic motivation actually comes from within, while extrinsic motivation arises from external factors. So intrinsically motivated individuals is when you engage in an activity or a learning activity because you enjoy it and you get personal satisfaction from it. And extrinsic is when you do something in order to gain a reward. So I'm going to study because I know that my parents are going to buy me a gift. So I think from my perspective, we increase motivation by understanding those two factors of what a student leans towards. So if they are intrinsically motivated or extrinsically motivated, you can kind of change up the environment in the classroom by creating specific ways to study according to their type of motivation. So if you know it's intrinsic, do things that motivate them internally. So it's your, how can I say this? By telling them, okay, you can do this because you will learn more, you will grow more, and those are the things that help you internally to grow. So I think that learning those two different types of motivation will help you increase the motivation in students. So changing up the environment, creating a safe learning environment, as well as encourage students with self-reflection. Again, that's intrinsic. And with regards to extrinsic, I don't know, with students, yeah, I know they are a lot older. If you're looking at students like from high school onwards, and if we look at extrinsic, it would be a bit weird to say, yeah, you get a teddy bear at the end of the week, because it doesn't necessarily work. But maybe saying that you get a certain advantage at the end of the week, you can maybe give your personal opinion on a certain section we study, and that can possibly motivate them to do better. But that's just my take on it. It's obviously just one aspect of motivation, which I think can work, but if anyone else has another input, it would be nice to share as well. I hope that answers your question though.
Thank you so much for that insight, Kiara. Dr. Diana, we do have one question and I think this will have to be our last as we are running out of time. How do we assess non-home language English learners if we cannot use the JSAIS or SAIS? It is a real challenge to judge ability and plan effectively for interventions.
Thank you, Steph. So yes, the JSAIS and the SAIS is primarily for English and Afrikaans speaking children, was normed in South Africa on those populations. However, there's two things. One, English, and in some instances, lesser cases Afrikaans, still remains the language of teaching. So it still remains important to, you can still use it qualitatively. And also you need to look at the child's developmental and scholastic history up to that particular point. So their preschool and their first early grades, for example, and also look at how you can look at sample of the child's writing, reading. So as much as you can build a case to support where are the child's areas of challenge and where are the areas child strengths. Also, there's something called the individual scales that is available from Mind Music, that does cover different languages and can also measure intelligence. So it's available in Northern Sotho, Southern Sotho, Tswana, Xhosa, and isiZulu. So it's an alternative measure. But I think what's important with a learning disability is providing a holistic picture. So it's being able to ensure that you also look at the emotional, also look at everything in a way that allows you to create a holistic image of their child to inform the particular interventions, and also work within a multidisciplinary team. So see where you would need to refer to other professionals to support and help with the diagnosis of the particular learning disability or multiple comorbid conditions that might be present. And also being well versed in the literature around languages, because according to most of the research, it will say that the children with dyslexia tend to have challenges in both their first and their second language. And usually you need about 3 years of instruction in your primary language to be able to support your second language development. So you need to have quite a good background in understanding children that speak multiple languages. And where possible, another strategy is to try and assess language proficiency in the first language, if it's spoken or written. And you might need, for example, a translator to assist you in that regard, should you not be well versed in the child's first language. And that's it from me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Diana. And once again, thank you so much to all our panelists. We have some lovely comments thanking you all for the information that you shared, as well as the insights and the strategies. I just want to thank you once again for your time, for joining us on a Saturday morning. We ask that you keep an eye on our social media channels for any updates, any upcoming webinars, teacher webinars. And if you would like to get in contact with any of our school liaisons to come and speak to your students, please feel free to also let us know in the chat box. Thank you once again. Have a lovely weekend further. And we hope you learned something today.